from the National Catholic Register. This is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
November has begun, and with it, we celebrate the saints and pray for souls. On Register Radio, we talk to longtime Register columnist John Grondelski about Catholics, All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, and visiting cemeteries. And then we look back at the final document of the Synod of Bishops on youth in Rome, where synodality became the gathering's closing theme. What will be the impact on the Church and on youth? From Rome, Edward Pentin weighs in. I'm Jeanette DeMelo, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register and co-host of Register Radio. I'm joined by Matthew Bunson, the Register's Senior Editor and co-host for Register Radio. Matthew, welcome back from Rome.
Thank you. It was a good number of weeks watching the synodal process, and all I can say is that synodality seems to be alive and well.
Very good. Well, we're going to have, I'm sure, a lively discussion on that. The Synod of Bishops, the title of it was on youth and vocational discernment, and of course it wrapped up after 4 weeks of work with, over 300 bishops? And while there was some controversy, it really it didn't have the controversial nature, I guess, of the last two synods. The final report, though, has some concerns, and we'll get to those in just a moment. We're joined by Edward Pentin, of course, our Rome correspondent, who has covered the last few synods. Edward, welcome.
Hi, good to be back with you.
So, Edward, after being there and watching the process of this synod, what are your takeaways from the synod itself and the process?
Well, I think the synod gave another good glimpse of the Pope's vision, the Holy Father's vision for the Church. I think very much it's a synodal one, and we saw that towards the end of the synod when that element came into it. But also, I think it also showed the Church's willingness to listen to youth, and I think there was a lot of efforts made to show this and to really try to understand youth today, and especially the challenges they face. Listening was a major part of the synod. Mm-hmm. Some say too much, but there was certainly a lot of listening going on, and we had the contributions of the auditors as well. So I think it was. It was, in the end, I think a lot of people felt it was a good two-way exchange, and I think they feel it's given a lot of material really for the Church to use going forward in how to help bring young people into the Church and help them in the Church.
Yes, and both you and Matthew were able to interview bishops or cardinals who participated. Matthew, you talked to Cardinal Napier. In fact, I think both of you ended up talking to Cardinal Napier, but also Archbishop Anthony Fisher. And both of them remarked as to the youth participating. So you mentioned auditors, and there were young delegates who were there in the room during the deliberations, and it was reported that really made this a much livelier synod. Yes,
it did. It was very much. It gave a lot of energy to the synod, and I think also as Cardinal Napier said, it helped lessen the tensions perhaps that we had in the previous synods, and
sure.
It's a bit harder to have an argument when there's young people around in a way.
Yeah.
And I think they had a moderating influence on it.
I think, Edward, when you and I had a chance to talk in some of our TV coverage, we even both agreed that in a way everyone was on their best behavior because they didn't want to look like
Yes.
a bunch of grumpy old men in front of the youth in the
That's
church.
a good example. Yes.
But the input of the young people, I had the impression in talking, as we both did, that it was something that actually was probably more effective and interesting than even some of the bishops had initially thought it might be.
Why is that?
Well, just from the sense that from the beginning there was a certain sense of ease. There wasn't quite, as Edward noted, the anxiety and some of the rancor that characterized the last two synods, 2014 and 2015, both on the family, both, of course, leading to Amoris Laetitia. And so the young people actually, it seems, had a lot to say. Now,
Sure.
There have been criticisms that some of it seemed kind of staged. And then there was, of course, the awkward dancing that finished the work of the synod. But that there was a sense of celebration right at the end, and I think for a lot of the bishops there was that idea of talking to young people, but also to listening to them, that everyone appreciated.
Sure. Now, we're going to turn to the final document, and Edward had pointed to 5 areas of concern in his blog of October 27th, and we'll get to those, I'll just list them real quick, but we'll get to them in a second. He mentions the Instrumentum Laboris, which is the working document, and how that was not a great document. Synodality is the second point that might be of concern. Homosexuality, the third. Women in the church, a fourth. And sexual abuse. And we'll turn to that in a minute. But before we do, we're talking about youth. What elements of the final report do you think are going to resonate most with the young people? How is this report going to serve them?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, some people say it's so long that it's unlikely they're ever going to read it, and it can be quite turgid in parts, as one Synod father said.
30,000 words, I think it was, something like that.
I think it is, yes. It's a manual, really, but I think there are also some inspirational passages in there. I think there's quite a lot of guidance on how young people can deal with the world, especially with the digital era that we're in, and I think that's obviously a big part of young people's lives, and that figured quite highly, I think, in the document. And also the whole issue of migration. There are lots of young migrants around the world who need help. And also in parts of Africa where it's just a question of survival for a lot of young people. This helps them, and at least it helps them to see the church as a place where they can go to and find help. But I think there's quite a lot in there, I think, that is helpful for young people. But I think that, as I said in this blog, I think there are a lot of concerns too. So it's very much a mixed bag.
Right. And so every paragraph of this final report was approved. It was voted upon, each graph, and it approved by a majority. But that doesn't mean, that people weren't concerned. There were some paragraphs, and mostly these points that you noted, that were debated and where there were a larger number of no votes. So let's talk. What were the most debated topics, and how did that play out? Where are the concerns?
Well, when you look at the voting figures, the one that got the most no votes was the paragraph 150 on sexuality. That was quite got a certain amount of resistance. But I saw the draft paragraph, and actually, when you compare the two, they submitted quite a few modi, the Synod Fathers, and actually made it a lot better than it was, I think, for a lot of the Synod Fathers.
Modis are amendments.
That's right, amendments or propositions, yes. And I think they were pleased that certain things were taken out. But there are still things in there which people feel are problematic, like changing the language and using words like the need for study of the Church's deepening of the Church's study of anthropology regarding sexuality, and also the Church. There's a phrase there which says that the Church should oppose all discrimination on a sexual basis. Now that's a change from the Catechism, which talks about opposing unjust discrimination, and that's of concern because, as somebody pointed out, if somebody within a Catholic institution is guilty of some sexual misdemeanor, it makes it perhaps impossible for that person to be dismissed or disciplined, because you're not supposed to discriminate in any way on a sexual basis. So that's another problem there. And I think, and then there's a whole part of that paragraph which talks about accompanying homosexual people, but it's unclear how, and that could be construed in probably two ways at least. One, the reproach of perhaps a Jesuit Father James Martin, who appears to wish to, I think, perhaps normalize homosexuality in the Church, and the Courage Apostolate, which counsels men and women with same-sex attractions to live chaste lives in fellowship, truth, and love. So I think there's a bit of a vague ambiguity there, and that's also of concern. So I think that's why it got so few votes. It still passed the 2/3, though, quite easily.
Right. I want to turn to this question of synodality. We just have a few minutes left. Matthew, I'll turn to you for a second just to, again, as the church historian, define what synodality traditionally means.
Well, yeah, one of the problems in a way is that the definition itself has been open to such interpretation. Pope Francis sees this, and the International Theological Commission sees this as simply a church that is journeying together and a church that is listening. And that is certainly one of the interpretations that was given at the press conferences during the Synod, especially when it suddenly appeared in the draft document, as has been noted. There are those, however, including Cardinal Vincent Nichols of Westminster, who's not known as a hardline conservative,
right,
who raised genuine concerns in the discussions during the Synod that synodality as a process in the life of the Anglican Communion, for example, has done immense damage to authority in the Church, and it poses threats for democratization and sort of a wearing down of magisterial authority
right,
that any form of democracy would create. So those are genuine concerns, I think.
Absolutely. And Edward, you've written before of this problem, the potential problem of decentralization within the church, and it certainly seems that this is a possibility that has now been written into this document. Of course, there are concerns over what will happen with this document. So let's close, I guess, with what's happening next. Where do we go from this point?
Well, I understand that from good sources, I believe that the Pope is planning to write a post-synodal apostolic exhortation, which normally happens. Mm-hmm. But there was debate about whether that would happen, because he did say that possibly he'll make this final document part of the papal magisterium, in which case it would make superfluous a post-synodal apostolic exhortation. But he does seem to be writing that, and that could probably be expected in the next few months. So that's what we've got coming after this, and I think it'll be probably a summary document on this, but also perhaps add some other things that the Pope wants to include, which perhaps weren't in the Synod. And I expect synodality will also figure highly in that.
And that's right, because we know that synodality entered into this final document because it was the Pope's wish, and there were two cardinals who brought that forward on behalf of the Pope, and to much surprise. So there's been much written about this at ncregister.com, of course, so please check out what we've written about the topic of synodality. It's something I don't think is going to go away. So Edward and Matthew, both of you, thank you for your reporting on the Synod. You did a wonderful job, and we look forward to, I guess, the next big thing in Rome.
Good. Thanks for being here.
When we come back, we will talk to Register contributor John Grondelski about All Souls Day, the saints, and Catholic cemeteries. This is Register Radio on EWTN.
Have you heard who's reading the Register? Why, it's Marcus Groda.
I believe EWTN's National Catholic Register is unique from other newspapers in that it not only is committed to reporting the news from the world and the Church and our faith, but it does so through the lens of the faithfulness of our Catholic Church.
For a 3-month free subscription to the National Catholic Register, go to ncregister.com and click on the 3 months free banner, or call 1-800-421-3230.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
Welcome back. I'm Jeanette DeMelo, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register, and I'm joined by Matthew Bunson, my co-host here on Register Radio. This week, the Church celebrated All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, and of course, we're in the month of November where we remember the souls of the departed. So in this swift succession, we've commemorated two very holy days. Today, we invite John Grondelski, a Register correspondent and columnist for a long time, to join us to talk about two articles he wrote for the Register on All Souls Day and one on visiting cemeteries. John, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
So, John, I was just we were just talking before the show that you and I have never met in person, and this is the first time we're actually getting to talk on the phone. But you have been writing for the Register for quite some time, haven't you?
I've been writing for the Register, I would say, for about 22 years now at this point.
It's awesome. It's awesome. It's so great to have your pieces, your columns, which often take us into the history of the church or outlining the culture, the deep Catholic culture of the church. And what you've written about this week, especially the theme of Catholic cemeteries and Catholic burials, is something that I know is important to you because almost every year we have a new column and a slightly new take on it. So I'm very grateful to have you on to talk about this. So let's start with the very basics. What is the significance for the Church of these two holy days we celebrated this week, and of course the entire month of November?
Well, I think if we consider these two holy days, we're looking at the entire Church. We're looking at the Church in this world, which is on its pilgrim way. We're looking at the Church to which we aspire to be part of, the heavenly Church. And we look at the Church that is in the process of purification, which is purgatory. So these 3 days are very ecclesiological. They're very focused on the nature of the Church, but the nature of the Church not just in this world, but the Church as it extends through time and space. That, of course, leads us with the end of the Church year into the eschatological themes that are very prominent in the last weeks of ordinary time: death, judgment, heaven, hell, accountability, the end of the world, and the meaning of human life. And that's traditionally been also marked by the Church by its dedication of the month of November to prayer for the deceased.
That's right. And these are not themes. Those four themes you just mentioned are not themes that we tend to look at very often in our culture anymore. And so it makes it very relevant that the Church takes this time to think about those themes. And that's really something that you wrote about in your piece on cemeteries and on visiting cemeteries. It's important, right, for us to have this moment to face the reality of death. Why is that important?
Well, I think for a number of reasons. I mean, in all times and places, the fact that we are mortal is something that should concern every human being. I mean, this is the one thing death is the one thing that is assured of every human person. And so it's not something that should be denied, even though we do try to do that. But as you said, I've focused on these issues pretty regularly in the past few years. And that's because I, as a moral theologian, feel a certain concern about tendencies in our culture. You know, St. John Paul II talked about a culture of death, and yet nevertheless, as much as death is even prescribed as a solution to human problems, we don't like to look it in the eye. We don't want to admit its ubiquity. We kind of, have shoved funerals off into the side. Cremation rates among Catholics are mirroring the general population, and the whole phenomenon of death, as much as we think of it as perhaps a solution of human problems, nevertheless is something we really don't want to look at. And that's what I think is also a concern, that cemeteries are literally disappearing, both as places that we put people who are buried, and then also as extensions of the church. And in this article, I try to bring out the idea that the cemetery is also both a sacramental and is also a place of the church that has gone before us. We call it hallowed ground. We spoke last week about Halloween, and that's where the term comes from, because we're talking about this. This is the door by which we hopefully come to the faith that God the Father wants of us in our Father's home.
And you also make a suggestion that we really should be visiting cemeteries. There's an indulgence that is possible for those who do visit. So what is required of us during this month to gain that indulgence, and what does that mean?
Well, in terms of the tradition of the Church, the visitation in the first days of November, I think the first 8 or 9 days of November, is attached to a plenary indulgence with the usual conditions that are associated with gaining an indulgence, being in a state of grace, confession, communion, prayer for the intentions of the Holy Father. Again, this is also connected to the notion of death and offering our prayers for others. You know, the deceased, the faithful departed need our prayers, they need our suffrages, because they are at that point in their life and their existence that they depend on us for our good works. And the indulgence, the theology of indulgence, I think, is terribly misunderstood. It is not buying off God. It is not attempting to, circumvent His justice, but is the recognition that, in our own little widow's mite, that we need somehow to repair the disorder that sin and evil brings into the world, and the Church, through the infinite treasury of Jesus' own merits, as well as the individual merits of the saints throughout history, allows us, in this sense of social community, to help those who are in a situation where they need our prayers and our help for their final salvation, just as we probably one day will be in a like situation.
That's right.
Well, John, you also help people, I think, to understand in another piece that you've written, All Saints' Day. And there's another term that we use, and that's communion of saints, that strikes me as very relevant for November. How can people understand the idea and the teaching of the communion of saints better?
Well, again, I think this is also tied up with an understanding of the notion of death, and why I'm a little bit concerned about the disappearance of cemeteries and the marginalization of our understanding of death and the afterlife. I recently read a piece in which the author cited Pope Benedict XVI, when I believe he was Joseph Ratzinger writing, a concept he calls apostasy of belief, which, to put it simple, means, we still say the words, we still use the language, we still have the pious platitudes, but do we really believe it? And so when we say that, this person has gone to a better place, or this person, has passed on to the Lord, I mean, yes, I hope we believe it, but I'm really concerned that, behind that, those proper words that are sanctioned by tradition and by our religious and cultural heritage, nevertheless, do we really have an idea that, yes, in fact, life is changed, not ended, and that, when God gives life for eternity. And so if we take that seriously, then yes, death does not divide us from those who have gone before us. The only people that we are divided from are those people that refuse to love, which is what hell is. And so when we talk about the communion of saints, what we're simply affirming is the fact that if we truly believe that life is not terminated by physical death, then we are joined together across time, across space, across the ages, in the love of one God.
Absolutely. What we're talking about here is just, it's so crucial, and yet it isn't something we think about often enough. Maybe every November, this is the Church's way of reminding us to think about this. But ultimately, what is this? What are we supposed to be thinking about? That our end is not here. in this life, in this earth, and the things that we're dealing with today and tomorrow and whatnot, that our end is somewhere else. It's hopefully in heaven with God, that there is an eternal life. And we have completely lost sight of this idea. And that's what this whole segment is about. That's what this whole month is about, is this reminder that this is not our end. And we need it. It's, we talk about cemeteries, and I can't remember actually, honestly, the last time I walked through one. And that's sad. This is a great reminder, John, to go to a cemetery and teach my kids about a cemetery, so that there is this realization that this isn't the end. But that's what it's all about, right? This whole month is to remind us of that.
That is what it's all about, and what it is in fact, I think, very much a countercultural statement, because our world and our society and our culture, while it accepts that death may be a solution to suffering or to terminal illness or etc., doesn't really want to engage in the question, and then what? And the cemetery is a sacramental reminder to us. I mean, we are a faith that is a faith grounded in physicality, in bodily reality. And the cemetery is a reminder to us that the body, which was a temple of the Holy Spirit, that these persons, these beings, are in some state of going on in their relationship with God, and that life just doesn't end with us. I have to say, one thing I've been recently working on and looking at is this saying I hear often today. Funerals are about the living and not the dead, and there's something true to that, but it's not completely true. And I certainly hope we're not focused simply on our own navels, because in point of fact, if we take seriously the idea that our loved ones have gone before us, then they also need our prayers, and we should reckon with the fact that our understanding of death means that we are in solidarity with them, and we need to help them just as we hope one day they will help us.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, John, for being with us on the show, but also for your years of writing for the Register.
I look forward to continuing it.
Amen. Remember, for more news, analysis, and commentary, check out the National Catholic Register online at ncregister.com. Thanks for joining us here on Register Radio on EWTN. For Matthew Bunson and our producer Jeff Burson, I'm Jeanette DeMelo. Until next week, God bless you.